There are moments in life when the weight of financial pressure feels like it's squeezing the very breath out of your chest. Moments when you look at your bills, look at your bank account, and whisper, Lord, do you see me? Do you hear me? And right there, right in the middle of your fear, your worry, your silent tears, God whispers back, I have never taken my eyes off you. Money has a way of testing the heart like few things can, not because God wants us to struggle, but because He wants us to learn the sacred rhythm of trust. A Christian's relationship with money is not a story of striving. It is a story of surrender. It's learning that provision doesn't begin in your wallet, it begins in your spirit. It's believing that God is not limited to earthly systems, earthly salaries, or earthly opportunities. When He decides to bless you, even the things that were meant to block you become stepping stones. Some of you listening right now are tired of carrying financial battles you were never meant to fight alone. But hear this today, God never asked you to be your own source. He asked you to trust His. Money was never meant to master you. It was meant to serve the God you serve. And when your heart aligns with His purpose, something powerful happens. Lack loses its authority. Be Christian and His money is not about chasing wealth. It's about partnering with heaven. It's about opening your hands so God can fill them. It's about walking in a faith that attracts divine provision. Today, lift your head, breathe deep, and know God is preparing to turn your financial story into a testimony of overflowing grace. When heaven becomes your source, something inside you shifts, slowly at first, then radically, unmistakably. You begin to look at life through a different lens, a lens where divine provision is not a distant hope, but a present reality. Many believers carry silent burdens, living with the fear of tomorrow while trying to survive today. But when heaven becomes your source, fear loses its grip because you finally understand that God does not supply you according to the economy of man, but according to the abundance of His glory. You stop measuring God by the size of your paycheck and start measuring life by the size of His promise. Suddenly, storms don't shake you the same way, because you know your supply doesn't come from the ground, it comes from above. And when the source changes, the stress changes. When the source changes, the strategy changes. When the source changes, the entire atmosphere of your heart changes. You begin to breathe again. You begin to hope again. You begin to expect again, because heaven never runs out. When heaven becomes your source, you step into a relationship with provision rather than a struggle with lack. God never intended for His children to navigate life with clenched fists, terrified of losing what little they have. He wants His people walking with open hands, ready to receive what He freely gives. In this realm of trust, money becomes a tool and not a torment. You understand that God is not trying to take from you. He is trying to get something to you. And sometimes the reason He delays a blessing is not because He is withholding, but because He is reshaping your capacity to receive. Heaven's supply is not fragile. It does not depend on inflation, job security, or business conditions. God's economy is not affected by global shifts. When heaven is your source, you understand that what leaves your hands never leaves your life. It simply moves into God's hands where multiplication begins. When heaven becomes your source, you start recognizing divine patterns, unexpected open doors, supernatural timing, favor that cannot be explained by logic. You begin to see how God aligns people, opportunities, and resources in ways your efforts never could. Earthly supply is limited by human strength, but heavenly supply operates by divine orchestration. God works behind the scenes, arranging what you didn't even know you needed. You stop forcing outcomes and start flowing with grace. You stop panicking over delays and start trusting divine timing. When heaven is the provider, promotion doesn't come from people, it comes from God. Breakthrough doesn't come from struggle, it comes from surrender. You no longer chase blessings. Blessings begin to chase you because God honors the heart that trusts His provision more than its own hustle. Heaven-backed favor is not accidental. It is intentional, strategic, and unstoppable. When heaven becomes your source, generosity becomes your natural response. Not because you have excess, but because you have confidence. You give not out of fear of running out, but out of faith that you cannot outgive God. When you trust Him as the provider, your heart becomes free from the chains of fear-based living. You don't cling to things anymore, you steward them. You don't see giving as loss, you see it as investment into the very system that sustains you. Heaven's economy works on seed and harvest, on trust and expectation, and when you start operating with heaven as your supply line, your spirit becomes lighter, your vision becomes clearer, and your decisions become bolder. You no longer ask, "What if I lose everything?" Instead, you declare, "As long as God is my source, I will never run dry." This confidence produces a peace that can't be shaken and a joy that can't be stolen. When heaven becomes your source, your entire identity shifts. You stop seeing yourself as someone trying to survive and start seeing yourself as someone destined to overflow. You begin to walk with the quiet authority of someone who knows they are backed by the resources of the kingdom. You understand that your needs are not burdens to God. They are invitations for Him to reveal His goodness. Financial challenges no longer intimidate you because you know they are simply opportunities for God to show you another dimension, His faithfulness. You start living from a place where miracles feel normal, favor feels natural, and increase feels inevitable. When heaven becomes your source, you finally realize that provision is not just something God gives, provision is who He is. And when your life aligns with that reality, you step into a flow of supply that transforms not only your finances but your entire future. Money obeys a surrendered heart because true financial breakthrough begins in the invisible places of the soul, not in the visible numbers of a bank account. When the heart bows before God, everything connected to life begins to align under His authority, including resources, opportunities, and provision. A surrendered heart is not a weak heart. It is a heart that stands in strength because it is anchored in trust. Many people chase money with panic and pressure, but money responds far more readily to peace than to fear. When your heart is yielded to God, money stops being a master and becomes a servant. You don't live in a frantic race to keep up. You live in a divine rhythm where God directs your steps and supplies your needs. Money always gravitates toward the place where purpose is established, and purpose flows from surrender. A heart surrendered to God carries a fragrance of obedience that attracts provision, because God funds what He owns. When He owns your heart, He commands your increase. Money obeys a surrendered heart because surrender transforms priorities. Suddenly you stop making decisions based on fear of loss and start making decisions based on trust in divine direction. A surrendered heart doesn't cling tightly to resources out of anxiety. It holds them with open hands because it knows the one who multiplies loaves and fishes can multiply income, favor, ideas, and opportunities. When your heart is surrendered, God can speak to you about where to sow, when to give, how to steward, and what to release. And every time you follow that prompting, something supernatural happens. What felt like sacrifice becomes seed, and seed never leaves your life. It enters your future. A surrendered heart doesn't fear giving because it understands heaven's economy is driven by generosity, not scarcity. Fear tells you to protect what you have. Surrender tells you to trust what God has. And trust is always rewarded. Money obeys a surrendered heart because surrender breaks the power of greed, anxiety, and self-reliance, the three forces that choke financial growth. When you surrender your heart, you surrender your fear of not having enough. You surrender your tendency to hold on too tightly. You surrender the lie that you alone must make everything happen. God cannot pour into clenched fists. He fills hands that are open. A surrendered heart becomes a channel instead of a container, and channels never run dry because they are constantly receiving and releasing. A surrendered heart stops asking, "How can I keep more?" and starts asking, "How can I honor God more?" This shift unlocks a flow that earthly striving can never accomplish. God begins to trust you with more. because he knows more will never own you. That is why surrendered people often walk in surprising abundance, not because they chase money, but because their heart posture keeps the flow of heaven open. Money obeys a surrendered heart because surrender creates clarity. When the heart is yielded, confusion breaks and direction becomes clear. Many people experience financial frustration not because of lack, but because they are disconnected from divine guidance. A surrendered heart hears God's whisper in decisions others overlook. It senses when to move, when to wait, when to invest, when to release, when to rest, and when to step out in faith. God speaks most clearly to the heart that is willing to obey before it understands. And when God sees that obedience, he begins aligning resources in ways you cannot orchestrate yourself. Unexpected favor appears. Closed doors suddenly open. Delays turn into redirections. What once felt impossible becomes attainable because you are no longer relying solely on logic. You are relying on the voice of God. Money responds to alignment, and alignment comes from surrender. A surrendered heart becomes a magnet for provision because it walks in divine order. Money obeys a surrendered heart because surrender positions you for supernatural trust. Trust that changes how you think, give, plan, and live. When your heart is fully surrendered to God, you stop fearing financial valleys because you know valleys are temporary and God is eternal. You stop doubting whether God will come through because you've seen him come through too many times before. You stop living paycheck to paycheck emotionally, even if you are still growing financially, because your confidence no longer comes from what you have. It comes from who holds your life. A surrendered heart sees money as a tool, not an identity, a blessing, not a burden, a resource, not a source. And because of that, money can flow freely without becoming toxic. God increases what will not replace him. When your heart is surrendered, God knows money will serve his will, not sabotage your soul. And so he entrusts you with more ideas, more opportunities, more influence, more supply, because your heart can handle what your hands are about to receive. God funds what he calls because his assignments are never dependent on human limitations. When God places a calling on your life, whether it is a ministry, a business, an idea, a mission, or a season of transition, he also attaches heaven's supply to that calling. Many people worry about how they'll afford the vision God has placed in their hearts, but God never asks you to finance what he authors. He asks you to trust him. When the call is real, the provision is guaranteed. It may not arrive in the timing you expect, the method you imagine, or the sequence you desire, but it always arrives in the form heaven chooses. A calling is not sustained by human strength. It is sustained by divine orchestration. When God calls you to walk on water, he already plans to hold you above the waves. When God calls you to build, he already assigns the resources. When God calls you to go, he already sends the provision ahead of you. God funds what he calls because his name is on the assignment, and heaven does not sponsor failure. God funds what he calls because his purpose carries its own economy. When he assigns you to something, he also aligns the people, opportunities, open doors, and financial streams needed to fulfill that purpose. Many believers carry dreams that seem too big for their bank accounts, but God delights in giving visions that exceed human resources. He wants you to lean on him, not your own understanding. He wants you to see that his calling is bigger than your connections, your finances, or your experience. He creates divine pathways in unexpected places. Sometimes the calling will stretch you, not because God is cruel, but because he is preparing you to operate on a faith level that matches your assignment. And when your faith rises to that level, provision follows. The provision may come through unusual people, unexpected favor, ideas you never thought of, or miraculous timing, but it will come because God always finances what carries his fingerprint. God funds what he calls because obedience activates supply. When you take the step he asks you to take, heaven releases the resources that step requires. Many people wait for provision before they move, but God often waits for movement before he releases provision. The first step is yours. The next 20 are his. God does not fund hesitation. He funds obedience. And when you obey without knowing the full plan, you position yourself in the flow of divine resources. Obedience is the key that unlocks the storehouses of heaven. Every time you follow God's prompting, something shifts. The path becomes clearer, the favor becomes stronger, the increase becomes visible. God looks for hearts willing to act on His word, even when the numbers don't add up. When you obey with faith, you give heaven permission to intervene in your earthly situation. And once heaven intervenes, no obstacle can block what God is funding. God funds what He calls because His provision is purposeful, not random. When God assigns resources, they are targeted to accomplish His intention for your life. He does not give you excess to waste. He gives you exactly the supply needed to grow, expand, build, and steward the calling placed on you. There are seasons where God provides gradually, teaching you discipline, trust, and stewardship. There are other seasons where He provides suddenly, releasing blessings that accelerate your assignment. Both patterns come from His wisdom. God funds His call in a way that develops your character, strengthens your faith, and positions you for long-term increase. You may not always see the provision in advance, but you will always see it in time. The timing is strategic. God knows when you are ready to carry more. He knows when certain doors need to open. He knows when certain people need to enter your life. His funding is never late. It is perfectly aligned with His design for your destiny. God funds what He calls because His faithfulness is woven into His purpose. When God calls you, He commits Himself to the outcome. He doesn't walk away when obstacles arise. He doesn't withdraw funding because seasons change. The same God who called you is the God who sustains you. When the path becomes difficult, He sends strength. When the way becomes unclear, He sends direction. When resources seem low, He releases fresh provision. God's calling carries a covenant of supply, protection, favor, and supernatural backing. And because the call comes from Him, the support comes from Him. You never walk alone into an assignment God gave you. You walk with the full authority of heaven standing behind you. God funds what He calls because your calling is not about you. It is about His kingdom, His glory, His purpose, and His plan unfolding through your life. And what God begins, He always provides for, sustains, and brings to fulfillment. Lack loses power when faith takes over, because faith shifts the atmosphere of your inner world before anything changes in your outer world. Lack begins its attack in the mind through fear, worry, anxiety, and the pressure of the unknown. But when faith rises, it silences the voice of fear and rewrites the narrative of your situation. Faith does not ignore reality. It simply refuses to bow to it. When faith takes over, you stop measuring your future by what you currently have and start measuring it by what God has promised. Suddenly, impossibilities feel smaller because the God behind you is bigger. You begin to breathe again. You begin to hope again. You begin to declare things that your eyes haven't seen, but your spirit knows are coming. Lack tries to convince you that you are stuck, but faith reminds you that you are being positioned. Lack tries to imprison you in limitation, but faith breaks open the doors and leads you into expectation. Lack loses its control the moment your heart decides to trust God completely. Lack loses power when faith takes over because faith changes how you see God and how you see yourself. When you live under the weight of lack, you feel small, inadequate, and unqualified. But when faith rises, you remember who you belong to. You remember that God is not intimidated by your shortage, nor is He hindered by your circumstances. Faith shifts your identity from "I don't have enough" to "God is my more than enough." Faith awakens courage inside you, pushing you to believe that your needs are not a burden to God. They are opportunities for Him to show His greatness. When faith dominates your heart, you stop seeing bills as threats and start seeing them as invitations for God to provide. You stop seeing empty accounts and start seeing the God who multiplies. You stop seeing closed doors and start seeing the God who creates doors. Faith moves you from survival mode into supernatural expectation, and when expectation rises, lack loses influence. Lack loses power when faith takes over, because faith activates divine movement in ways that human effort cannot. Many people try to overcome lack with more striving, worry, or overworking, but faith achieves what effort never will. Faith triggers divine intervention. Faith opens doors that talent cannot. Faith touches hearts that influence cannot. Faith creates opportunities that planning cannot. When faith takes over, heaven responds, angels move, favor aligns, unexpected provision appears, paths open that were once blocked. Faith is the currency of God's kingdom, and where it is present, supernatural supply flows. Lack tries to limit you to earthly systems, but faith connects you to heavenly resources. Faith lifts you above the natural into the realm where miracles are normal. And when you step into that realm, lack becomes powerless. Not because you ignore reality, but because you tap into a higher reality. God honors faith, and wherever faith is active, lack is dethroned. Lack loses power when faith takes over because faith dissolves fear and births boldness. Lack often keeps people frozen, afraid to give, afraid to move, afraid to try, afraid to believe for more. Fear whispers, what if it doesn't work? But faith whispers back, what if God shows up? Faith does not wait for perfect circumstances. It steps forward in obedience and lets God handle the results. Faith gives even when the numbers say not to. Faith moves even when the path is unclear. Faith expects even when nothing has changed yet. And every act of faith weakens the hold of lack. The more you exercise faith, the smaller lack becomes. You begin to realize that lack is not a wall, it's a shadow. It only looks powerful until faith shines through it. When faith takes control of your heart, you stop living defensively and start living courageously. You stop settling for barely enough and start believing for more than enough. Fear retreats, courage rises, lack loses its voice. Lack loses power when faith takes over, because faith places your trust in God's promise rather than your own ability. Faith anchors you in the truth that God has a plan, a supply, and a timing that far exceeds your understanding. When faith dominates your spirit, you stop panicking at the sight of empty places and start preparing for God's fullness. You start speaking life over areas that once felt hopeless. You start acting like someone who expects provision, not someone who is terrified of shortage. Faith brings stability, peace, and clarity. It keeps you steady when circumstances shake. It keeps you confident when resources shift. Lack cannot control a person whose faith is rooted in God's unfailing nature. When faith is in command, you walk differently, think differently, and give differently. You live with the quiet confidence of someone who knows that God is Jehovah Jireh, the one who sees, the one who provides, the one who sustains. And when faith becomes your foundation, lack loses every ounce of power it once held over your life. As we come to the close of this message, let your heart hold on to every truth that has been poured into your spirit today. You have heard that when heaven becomes your source, your entire life shifts into a realm where divine supply replaces human struggle. You've seen how money responds to a heart surrendered to God, how obedience unlocks supernatural flow, and how trust attracts the kind of provision that cannot be explained by earthly reasoning. You've learned that God funds every assignment He places on your life, and that no vision born in His presence will ever die from lack. And above all, you've discovered that lack loses every ounce of power the moment faith takes the throne of your heart. This message is not just information, it is an invitation. An invitation to step out of fear and into confidence, out of scarcity and into abundance, out of self-reliance and into divine partnership. If you carry anything from this moment, let it be this: you are not alone, not forgotten, not abandoned, and never without a source. God is moving ahead of you, preparing increase, shaping opportunities, and aligning provision with your purpose. Every principle you heard today is a stepping stone into a future filled with supernatural supply. So lift your head, quiet your fears, and let faith rise. You are stepping into a season where God Himself becomes your provider, your multiplier, and your sustainer. The Christian and his money is not a story of struggle. It is a story of trust, grace, and divine overflow. Thank you for listening. May God bless you, uplift you, and surround you with unending favor.